Super excited to introduce Aradhna Tripati, who is an associate professor at UCLA. So Aradhna is affiliated with several departments and research institutes at UCLA, including the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences and the Department of Earth, Planetary and Space Sciences. And she's the founder and director of the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science. Aradhna's received several awards for her research and teaching and outreach programs. And I think the coolest of these is that Aradhna got the PCASE, which is the Presidential Early Career Award in Science and Engineering. And so I think that means you got to meet President Obama, or it was definitely awarded by President Obama. So that's super cool. So Aradhna's academic journey as a climate scientist started really early on when she was just 12 years old, and she started her undergrad degree at Cal State in LA. She went on to get her PhD in Earth Sciences at UC Santa Cruz, where she studied the dynamics of greenhouse climates using stable isotope signatures in carbonate fossils. Then after her PhD, she became a postdoc and research fellow at the University of Cambridge, and she did some really influential work on what happened to ocean circulation during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And I can attest to the fact that this was rapidly incorporated into the undergrad syllabus, and I got to learn about it just a year or two later, so that was cool. So then after that, Aradhna became a visiting scientist at Caltech, and she was on the forefront of developing the clumped isotope technique that she'll be talking about today. And Aradhna is also going to talk today about her Center for Diverse Leadership in Science that she set up after moving to UCLA. So Aradhna's been a really strong advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion in science. And just this week, she was on CNN talking about the climate emergency and the importance of Indigenous rights and expertise in Native communities. So really lucky to have Aradhna here today to talk about frontiers of carbonate clumped isotope geochemistry within an inclusive science framework. Thank you, Aradhna.
Oh, thanks so much for that really lovely introduction, Megan. And it's so exciting to see you again after so long. And I see there's quite a few familiar faces. I just want to do a quick check-in. Can folks see the screen here? You can see my slides?
Yeah, I can see your slides. You're not in full screen mode yet, but we can see the slides.
Oh, it's not in. Okay, let's see. Let's try this again. How's this?
That's perfect. Yeah.
All right, great. So I also realized that I don't know most of the people who are participating here today. So because it's our first meeting for many of us, I'm going to start off with a personal introduction to position myself in the geosciences. My name is Aradhna Tripati, and my pronouns are she, they. My parents are immigrants from the Fiji Islands with some ancestry from India due to both having been colonies of the UK. And because of my family history, I've thought about how we've each inherited cultural legacies, how this shapes our perspectives on social interactions, including in science, to how we view Earth systems. Just over a decade ago, when I joined the faculty at UCLA, I appreciated that it was a land-grant institution. And so I then learned about its complex history with Indigenous peoples. As a result, much of my work has intentionally been reparative as a faculty member in geoscience, where I've worked to emphasize the empowerment of Indigenous peoples and other BIPOC peoples, and also supporting healthy relationship building with non-BIPOC peoples. And by BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Now, this work has really come to the fore recently in response to thinking about the ways that anti-Black and anti-BIPOC violence are expressed across society. And this was really something that came to the forefront early last summer, with the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and then more recently this year with Daunte Wright, Adam Toledo. We're really starting to engage with these questions of how do we reform our institutions across society so that we can achieve transformative change that creates healthy and supportive environments that everybody can be part of. Now, I'll talk about some of the work that we've been doing, both the science that's come out of the approaches that we've used, as well as towards the end of the talk, the kind of some of the social science interventions and practices that we have that make the science that we do inclusive science. I also want to do a land acknowledgement and mention that UCLA is on the lands of the Tongva people who have been impacted by 3 waves of colonialism. And also that I'm a guest at the University of Maryland, which is on the lands of the Piscataway peoples, and that the lands and waterways of both regions have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples for generations. The work I'll show today has very much reflects my training as an undergraduate at Cal State LA, a minority serving institution, and then as a graduate student at Santa Cruz, at the University of Cambridge as a postdoc, visiting researcher at Caltech, but also the really amazing interactions I've had with students and collaborators and community partners whilst I've been at UCLA. And so I list some of these thought partners really who have contributed to the work that I'll show today on this first slide. And what I'll do is I'll really highlight over the course of the talk the work we've been doing in climate science, some of the work that relates to stewardship, as well as some of the work we've been doing directly relating to social justice instead. Now, my main motivation as a geoscientist comes from seeing events like these. These are what I show here, for example, on the upper left is a photo from the aftermath of the fire in Paradise, California. And the upper right is a photograph from a neighborhood that was impacted in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. And at the very bottom, I show a photo from Hurricane Sandy. Now, about 2 years ago, I heard this story on NPR about the experiences that young kids, ages 8, 9 years old, were having in schools after the fire in Paradise. Their families, in some cases, they'd lost their homes, their belongings, but in other cases, the kids had also lost a parent. And so they didn't have words when talking to their school psychologist to really process what they were experiencing because it was so overwhelming. And in doing so, I reflected on loss that climate change can bring and thought about other forms of loss that I myself have experienced. And I appreciated then the scars that could leave on individuals, on family, on communities, and how that could really define the entire lives that people had. Now, one thing to appreciate is that when we look at climate change impacts, these impacts are skewed, right? In some cases, we have populations that are much more vulnerable. In particular, when we look at severe climate change impacts in communities of color and low-income communities, we can see not just experiences that might happen for a year or a decade, but sometimes people can experience lifelong and in other cases, multi-generational effects. And this is actually described by a social scientist, Mike Davis, in a book he wrote, Late Victorian Holocaust, El Nino and the Making of the Third World, where he describes how 3 severe El Ninos at the end of the 19th century, back when the world had about 1 billion people, 20 to 60 million people lost their lives due to famine and drought, really the geopolitical response to hydrologic drought induced by 3 severe El Ninos and their atmospheric footprints, essentially, in different regions, including India, China, East Africa, and Brazil. And so really colonialism at that time ended up shaping future outcomes for entire countries, people. And I'm struck by when I look at the news, in any given year, time when the world has a population around 8 billion people, we see 20 to 60 million people may be at risk in a particular country, for example, that may be experiencing severe weather. And so this is something that then has really made me become incredibly intentional about thinking about ways that I could use my training as a paleoclimatologist to work to better understand what climate change impacts might be in the future. Now, perhaps some of the most well-known of this type of work in paleoclimatology comes from Larry Edwards' group at the University of Minnesota. This shows a really kind of exquisitely dated, high-resolution oxygen isotope record from a cave in China that spans the last, and this cave deposit, this speleothem, spans the last 2,000 years. And what you can see from his work is that there's evidence for the decline of 3 major dynasties coinciding with periods of weakening monsoons. When the monsoons strengthen, there's also evidence that in some cases, more prosperous dynasties arose. Now, it turns out there's evidence suggesting these types of links when we look at records in other regions. And even if we just look at records from the last 200 years, we see that there's evidence for possible links like these. Now, what I'm also struck by as a paleoclimatologist is that over the last 200 years and the last 2,000 years, our planet has had relatively static climatic conditions. So what these records suggest is that relatively small changes in temperature and rainfall can lead to environmental factors that can amplify social inequities and lead to major disruption. Yet the conditions that we and our grandkids, kids and grandkids will see over their lifetimes will be very, very different. They'll be much larger than these. So the questions that motivate me as a paleoclimatologist include understanding what factors influence regional expressions of climate change, both the amount of warming that we might have in the oceans and on land in different regions. For example, how warm do the warmest open ocean regions on the planet, like the West Pacific warm pool, how warm do they get? Do these areas get? How have they responded to climate forcing in the past? What does that tell us about the temperature water vapor feedback, for example? Also interested in understanding questions about how regional expressions of rainfall have changed through time. And this was work that was really motivated by some recent studies, including what I show at the very bottom by Nuti and Sedlacek, where they took the CMIP-5 models, the climate model intercomparison projects, their 5th version of this, where they look at a few dozen different model simulations that are run with the same boundary conditions, in this case, using a particular emission scenario for the 21st century. And then they calculate a multi-model average, which is what's shown by the colored fields. And then they also, in this case, show which models agree in the sign of changes. You know, what regions do we see models agreeing in the sign of changes, and in what regions do we see they don't agree? So in this case, for June, July, August rainfall, the areas that are not stippled are the ones where the models disagree as to whether it'll be more rainy or less rainy. So let's look at those areas. There are vast parts of the Western US, large parts of South America, large parts of the African continent, and in fact, quite large parts of Asia as well. Well, that's really troubling because when we think about planning for adaptation, resiliency planning for climate change, we have to know whether it's going to be more rainy or less rainy. Certainly the models all agree that in all futures envisioned, it's going to get warmer. And so we know that evaporation rates are going to get higher. But understanding limitations on water are really critical for planning. And so with that, I began to wonder whether we could actually look at the paleoclimate record and assess whether it's been more or less wet in different regions in the past, and then understand the underlying atmospheric dynamical mechanisms that and how they're represented in models to start to evaluate model skill. Now, I'm also interested in understanding questions about how do deep ocean temperature and ice volume change through time? How have they contributed to things like the iconic marine benthic oxygen isotope record from foraminifera? And doing this to understand the evolution of ice sheet stability under high versus moderate versus low CO2 levels. So today I'm going to really touch on some of the work we've been doing, looking at the chemistry of Earth materials. We're focused on this particular technique called clumped isotopes that I'll describe in more detail in the slides to come. And so we make these mass 47 or delta 47 measurements to reconstruct paleoclimate. I'll talk about what we're doing to reconstruct temperature as well as rainfall changes in land in the Western US. A lot of the work that I'll show is actually led by an Indigenous graduate student, Alexandria Arnold, as well as other BIPOC students who are part of my group. As part of our work, we've also been engaging more broadly with different tribal authorities and tribal institutions across the Southwest to discuss how we can use different knowledge systems, both traditional STEM knowledges as well as Western STEM knowledge, in support of stewardship, climate adaptation, and climate resilience. And then with all of the work that we're doing, of course, people are at the heart of it, right? And having diverse perspectives in the work that we do, having people look at problems with new cultural perspectives, new forms of disciplinary training, makes the science that much more innovative. And so I'll talk about how we're putting educational theory into practice to support science innovation. But also at the same time, by doing so, we're supporting healthy relationships, reparative processes, and justice, as well as carbon drawdown and sustainability in the face of environmental change. And so we're doing this work within the framework that I developed for a particular structure for a Center for Broadening Participation. And I'll describe that towards the end of the talk. All right, so historically, stable isotope geochemistry has looked at molecules with single rare isotope substitutions in them relative to the most abundant isotopic species or isotopologues as a tracer of chemical processes in a range of materials, from biological to geological to synthetic. And your department is so fortunate to have one of the most brilliant isotope geochemists in the country, James Farquhar, doing this work in really challenging systems, including sulfur systems. Well, just as James has kind of broke things open for a new era in using sulfur isotopes, John Eiler did this with respect to the field of clumped isotope geochemistry, where he explored looking at multiple rare isotope substitutions in molecules, which we also term heavy isotope pairs or heavy isotope clumps. So now we've moved beyond, John's lab has moved beyond his initial work looking at carbon dioxide and carbonate minerals to also start to probe clumping in a range of different compounds, including N2O, O2, methane, but also organic molecules. And so we're going to see this frontier in stable isotope geoscience really start to expand and grow in all sorts of interesting ways in the decades to come. His work has also demonstrated the real importance of using this approach for tracing not just geothermometry, but also tracing the kinetics of different processes. So when the first papers were published back in 2004 and 2006, I was a research fellow at the University of Cambridge and focusing on different applications of prior really exciting proxies, trace element-based proxies for doing geothermometry in paleoceanography. But I saw the potential for this clump technique, and so asked John if I could really work to develop this as a tracer in paleoceanography. So I took my fellowship to go work in his lab and had the opportunity to develop it as a proxy in foraminifera and in coccoliths, which really laid the groundwork for this tool being used to study ocean history. So foraminifera and coccoliths are basically the bread and butter archives that we use for reconstructing Earth's climate history, the oceans. My subsequent work then really emphasized doing large studies of modern samples from freshwater systems to also explore developing this tracer for terrestrial paleoclimatology. So one of the main areas that carbonate clumped isotope geochemistry has to offer the broader geosciences community is as a geothermometer, because it's based on thermodynamic equilibria, based on the same principles that govern the carbonate water oxygen isotope thermometer. Now, Harold Urey in the 1940s did calculations looking at partition functions for different isotopic species, including clumpy species, the clumpy variants of molecular hydrogen, D2, in some of his landmark work. But it was 17 or so years ago that John Eiler revisited Urey's work, specifically then exploring clumping in CO2 and in other compounds using theory, including carbonate minerals. And then he also undertook the really challenging work of developing analytical capabilities to be able to measure these really rare isotope species. And in doing so, he helped to pioneer this new area of geochemistry. And so the basis for the geothermometer is the fact that the substitution of a heavy for a light isotope reduces the vibrational frequency of a bond and therefore its zero-point energy. So in the case of isotope exchange reactions, such as what I show at the top for calcium carbonate, these zero-point energy differences represent a thermodynamic driving force that they really provide a thermodynamic driving force that promotes the stability of clumpy species at lower temperatures. Now, these energetic differences are really, really subtle, and you can get a sense of that by looking at the equilibrium constant for this reaction that was calculated by Edmund Schobel, who, when he was a postdoc working with John Euler. And so these are calculations for 3 different carbonate minerals. You can see that over more than 500 degrees centigrade, the equilibrium constant varies in the 4th decimal place. So that's pretty subtle. And this is really important because if we want to be able to do precise and accurate paleoclimate reconstructions over the types of temperatures that we see on Earth's surface, we have to be able to measure the abundance of this clumpy species and the other species that participated in this isotope exchange reaction with a high degree of precision. We have to know that the mineral also formed in equilibrium and that it wasn't subsequently altered. Now, I also just want to introduce some notation to you. You can see that the carbonate ion group in this calcium carbonate mineral has this clumpy species has a mass of 63 AMU. And so we can report its abundance in a sample using this particular delta notation, where we compare the ratio of the mass 63 isotopolog to the most abundant mass 60 carbonate isotopolog. And we report the parts per thousand excess of this mass 63 isotopolog in our sample compared to what would be there if there was a stochastic distribution of isotopes amongst all possible isotopologs. So our high precision measurements, though, are not directly made on carbonate minerals. We actually measure the carbon dioxide that's evolved after acid digestion minerals. And so then instead of actually having CO3 groups with mass 63, we actually measure 13C, 16O, 18O groups. So they have a mass of 47. So the mass 47 CO2 is related to the mass 63 carbonate ion group using an acid digestion fractionation factor. And we also report its abundance using a similar notation, in this case, looking at the 47 to 44 ratio. I also want to highlight that there are other mass 47 isotopologs. So we have to do these mass-dependent corrections for their abundance. I write out actually the full definition of mass 47 at the bottom in our notation, where R refers to the ratio of the heavy isotope to the light isotope. Now, we also measure mass 48 and 49 isotopologs. These are typically used to screen for contaminants. And there's some work, we're one of 2 labs in the world that are doing this work that are really emphasizing making accurate and precise enough measurements of mass 48 to probe kinetic effects. All right, so the promise of clumped isotopes in paleoclimate has been slow to be realized in paleoclimate research because of a number of bottlenecks. This includes large sample sizes, having relatively limited sample sets for doing calibration work or systematic studies, questions about the prevalence of disequilibrium behavior, interlaboratory comparisons being really limited. But I want to highlight that because of the work of a number of different groups, including leadership from Kristen Bergman at MIT, who's an assistant professor there coming up for tenure soon, we've made a lot of progress along these lines to address these issues. And so what's shown on the left is the delta 47 value of a series of different carbonate standards from an interlab calibration study or interlab comparison study that was just published this year. And so we've had about 24 different labs participate. And what you can see is the mean value on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, individual lab values in a one-to-one line. The circles are data from each individual lab participating in the study, and then the colored symbols are the long-term means for the different instrument configurations I have in my lab, and then the red is our average. So what this shows is that we run a tight ship, our data are accurate and precise. What I also want to highlight is that in the upper right, we've gone from the work that I published about 10 years ago, which was the most extensive systematic study done of any type of carbonate, at that time out of Caltech, where I measured about 42 samples of foraminifera and coccoliths, to now we have close to 300 data points to look at systematics. And we have similar size sample sets for synthetic carbonates and for freshwater carbonates, which actually means that we're getting to the point now where we're able to approach using Bayesian frameworks to explore calibration systematics, which is really going to just add, much higher, much more accurate estimates of uncertainty, basically, from the work when we are able to publish this work that's underway right now. Now, our work, in addition to showing that there are a number of different types of materials that are in quasi-equilibrium, there's also evidence that there are some materials that are not. And so what I show on the bottom right is work from Rob Ulrich, a graduate student in my group, looking at different types of cultured marine organisms. Some have shells that are aragonitic, some have aragonite and high mag calcite, others have low mag calcite. And because these are all cultured at 25 degrees C, we know that their value should be something like that horizontal line. But what we see is, in fact, there's a range of different values that we see. We actually worked with organisms that were cultured from anywhere from 400 ppm PCO2 to about 3,000 ppm PCO2. So what this work has allowed us to do is identify then what types of carbonates can be used for paleoclimate reconstructions with confidence. What are ones where they're actually just exciting to study because we can start to probe the origin of kinetic effects in their clump signatures. And that's a whole other talk that I could give. So the next part of the talk, I really want to highlight then some of our results looking at what factors influence regional expressions of climate change. I want to highlight the work that I show represents the contributions of this body of students, undergraduates, graduate students, and postdocs at my institution and at other institutions. And these questions that are bolded are the primary ones that I'll talk about today that relate to terrestrial hydroclimates. But we have other folks in the group and other collaborators who are working on some of these other questions that also really, really excite us. All right, so the Pleistocene has been a time interval that has been targeted for lots of paleoclimate research, in part because people are interested in understanding fundamentally what drives orbital cycles that we see in records like this beautiful ice core record of CO2, but also people are interested in understanding what drives changes in their amplitude over time to what drives abrupt events. Now, for the work that we're doing to reconstruct paleotemperatures, we're particularly interested in looking at the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, because we know the radiative forcing from insolation, from CO2, methane. We also have a pretty good handle on things like ice sheet extent, which is another major factor influencing Earth's radiative budget. So because of that, it's also the last glacial maximum is actually also a key time interval for model intercomparison projects. There's the Paleoclimate Model Intercomparison Project, or PMIP, that runs models using the same sets of boundary conditions for different paleoclimate intervals, just like CMIP does. Now, Rito Nuti at ETL wrote a really influential piece when he was one of the co-chairs of the IPCC. And what that I show in the lower left, and what that piece kind of explored was the appropriateness of using multi-model averages, or this kind of one climate model, one vote approach, when we know that models perhaps are when there may be some that have systematic biases, such as the ones that are doing the best job at representing climate change in Maryland may not be the same ones that do a terrific job, say, in Greenland. And so he suggested that models could be downweighted or upweighted based on their ability to reproduce observations, that we can really think about ways to evaluate model skill. And so Julia Hargreaves and others, Juan Laura, more recently working in my group and with Jonathan Mitchell, have really led using this approach when thinking about paleoclimate. And so I'm going to take you next to the Western US. This image shows the Great Basin, which is the largest inwardly draining region in the largest inwardly draining closed basin region in North America. And what you can see is the Great Salt Lake in the upper right for scale. What you also see is the outline of Pleistocene lakes, the darker blue color. And you can see, like, for example, there's this glacial Lake Bonneville that's present. That's actually the size, at the last glacial maximum, it was the size of one of our Great Lakes. So this led us to pose the question, what drove the drying out of Bonneville what's driven the drying out actually of these lake systems throughout the West? What's interesting is that this question is one that's been posed by geoscientists for the last 150 years, and a number of hypotheses have been posed that have still not been resolved. Some have suggested that warming has led to an acidification of these lakes because of increased evaporation. Others have suggested that with the retreat of the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, we actually saw changes then in moisture steering from the westerlies that actually led to the drying out of these lakes. And yet others have suggested that, in fact, changes in the intensity and areas where moisture was being delivered by the North American monsoon were actually the predominant driver. And it's also possible that all of these factors actually were important, but contributed to water balance to differing degrees depending on the exact region and exact time interval that we're looking at. So what I'll show you next is that we're actually able to start to parse some of this out with the data that we're collecting. All right, so the approach we're using is looking at clumped isotope measurements in terrestrial carbonates, from freshwater carbonates to soil carbonates. Most of our freshwater carbonates are from lakes, and when we have estimates of lake water temperature from shoreline deposits, from drill core, where we're looking at, drill core, where we're looking at carbonates that formed in the surface of the lake. What we can then do is use modern transfer functions to estimate air temperature. One of the realizations I had about 8 years ago is that we could also then use that to estimate evaporation rates using a modified Penman equation from Linacre. And then if we have a closed basin where we know the geometry of the basin at the last glacial maximum due to a mapping out of shorelines, and if it's a large basin like Bonneville, also doing some isostatic corrections. If we have that and we know and we have an estimate of evaporation rates, then we can actually estimate changes in precipitation rates, because fluctuations in lake level are going to reflect changes in precipitation relative to evaporation. So we used an additive multiplicative model from Matsubara and Howard to do a first order set of estimates of precipitation rates. Danabara worked with a graduate student of mine to use a slightly different approach with different sets of systematic errors and assumptions built in, which is actually to use basin hypsometry in concert with our estimates of the delta 18O of lake waters to then estimate changes in precipitation. We do have to make an assumption about isotopic steady state, and that may not be valid in all cases, but it likely is justified for things like the tufas or microbialites we're looking at, because they form under conditions of relatively stable lake levels at their respective elevations. We're starting to work with on really adapting this model to also use in open lake settings, and also trying to get constraints not just on surface hydrology, which is what this is giving us, but also subsurface hydrology, get constraints on groundwater changes. I'm using a novel approach that Jory Lerbeck, who's joining my group as a postdoc fellow, developed at the University of Utah as a PhD student. Now, I want to highlight that prior to this work, the estimates that we had of precipitation rates were based on pollen in the terrestrial realm. So we didn't really have any proxy constraints that were robust. This represents a first order thermodynamically based set of estimates of temperature, of water isotopes, of evaporation rates, and of rainfall rates. So our work starts off always with either working with collaborators who have done extensive characterization of samples in the field, geochronology, other forms of geochemistry, and in some cases paleoecology. In the case of our work in Bonneville and some of the other lakes I'll show you, my students also spent time with collaborators out in the field, mapping out shorelines, collecting samples, doing some of the geochronology, and developing hydrographs. But I'm just going to move to kind of showing you some of the results from their work with respect to our temperature and rainfall reconstructions. What's shown here is the shoreline for the ancient Lake Bonneville. There on the left, you can see there's two different subbasins, which we think had slightly different water depths. And we've sampled a number of different locations around the shoreline. In the middle, you can see that this data plotted as a function of paleolatitude from about 39 to 42 degrees north. And you can see the modern temperatures and modern water isotopes indicated with the colored fields. So what we see is that today there's evidence for non-uniform heating in the Great Salt Lake, and the warmer temperatures we see in the Sevier subbasin supports that this was also occurring during the last glacial maximum. We see evidence for temperature changes that are about 9 degrees centigrade compared to the present day. And if we look at sites that are much further to the west of Lake Bonneville, that's what I show in the lower right, we can also see what do those temperature reconstructions look like and how do they compare to Bonneville and how do they compare to climate models. So every single colored field there is a model from the Paleoclimate Model Intercomparison Project, the temperature scales in degrees centigrade, and the three lakes that are shown are all relatively small lakes, unlike Lake Bonneville. What's interesting is that Lake Chuacan and Lake Surprise, the two northernmost lakes, also show evidence for something like a 9 degree plus or minus 3 degrees C temperature change from the LGM to the present day. The southernmost site that we looked at, Mud Lake, shows a temperature depression that's about half of this amount. Now, if we actually look at the time series of data for Lake Bonneville, and we use those temperature data to calculate evaporation rates and also to look at use that modeling approach to look at precipitation rates, what we see is that this, for all phases of this giant lake, evaporation, there's evidence that evaporation was consistently suppressed by the fact we had cooler temperatures back then, with rates that were about 25 to 30% of modern values. But what we also see is that the changes in evaporation are much larger than the changes in precipitation, which suggests that both factors contributed to the size of the lake, but the main factor that sustained the lake was reduced evaporation. We also see that at Bonneville, there's evidence for changes in rainfall evolving over time, and in fact, with rainfall rates increasing as we go through the transgressive phase of the lake, with a maximum at the Bonneville high stand at about 18,000 years ago, followed by a reduction during what's termed the Provo phase of the lake. So how do these results compare to other constraints for the region? One of the nice things about Bonneville is that there are other constraints from a few other proxies. Our data are broadly consistent with temperature estimates from amino acid racemization and from pollen. I also show here temperature changes that we estimate for the LGM to present and the factor change in precipitation compared to results from glaciological modeling from Brendan Cork's work at the University of Utah. And you can see that those are also broadly consistent. Now, what happens when we compare the results when we look at the results for the precipitation anomaly and we compare that to climate models? Well, that's what's shown in the left for Bonneville, where we take our precipitation estimates for changes from the LGM to the present day, and we derive model skill scores for the ensemble mean and then for each individual model. So this number can be interpreted as a model skill in basically depicting the past climate changes with respect to the null hypothesis of no change between the LGM and modern. So the number 1 means that the simulation was perfect at reproducing the observations. If the model's poor, then the number is going to be small. And what we can see is that in the case of negative numbers, in fact, the model error is greater than the case of the null hypothesis. So there are 3 models that yield a positive skill score for this one location, where we also do have data now for other sites, actually now that span from Oregon to Mexico, and we're just starting to kind of dive into understanding those data. But I wanted to show you the results for 3 of the sites to give you a sense of the power of this approach for inferring changes in atmospheric dynamics. Jessica Oster, Dan Ibarra, and others had argued by looking at an analysis of the PMIP models that there is evidence for a moisture dipole, a precipitation dipole in the Southwest at the last glacial maximum. You can see this beautifully expressed in the F-goals model in the kind of center left, where you see these two kind of blue hotspots and then kind of an orange hotspot near Lake Surprise. Now, what's also interesting is that if you look at the models more closely, the models fall into two groups: a skilled category where models, or one group where the models reproduce this precipitation dipole, and then another group where they don't show it at all. So what do our reconstructions look like? Well, what's interesting is that our data for our precipitation reconstructions actually support the presence of a moisture dipole. You can see that Lake Chuacan and Mud Lake are slightly more blue, and Lake Surprise is slightly more yellow. But what's also interesting is that they support an asymmetry to this dipole, and that we're able to quantify this asymmetry. It looks like at Lake Chuacan, at the northern side of the dipole, these changes in precipitation were relatively subtle compared to Mud Lake, whereas at Mud Lake, the changes in rainfall were something like 10 to 20 times modern values, which is pretty interesting. Whereas at Lake Surprise, there was actually less rainfall. Now, we think that's probably due to changes in the westerlies being the driving factor for what we get at Lake Chuacan, that not actually penetrating to Lake Surprise. But then in the case of Mud Lake, both atmospheric rivers as well as changes in the North American monsoon being important factors contributing to elevated levels of precipitation during the last glacial maximum in deglaciation. And we're starting to test this further using the water isotope data that we have and isotope-enabled models. Now, I want to give you a sense of just kind of what this kind of extensive data set looks like. This is very recent work from graduate student Alexandria Arnold. And so we haven't yet had a chance to dynamically parse out the significance of these rainfall changes and the temperature changes. But the circles are showing our data from clumped isotopes for lakes and for paleosols. And then the squares at the very top show some of the temperature changes inferred from pollen. And we're extremely excited to kind of dive into this further. I also show some of the model skill scores in the lower left for models that are skilled and then not very skilled, basically, is the comparison. Now, this map type approach for different intervals is one that was basically created to be able to directly intercompare our results with climate model simulations inspired by the landmark CLIMAT program. So our vision for the future of ClumpMap is to not just look at the last glacial maximum when we had extensive lakes, but also to try to understand why was it during high CO2 warm intervals like the mid-Pliocene and early Eocene, why were there also large lakes in the Western US? And so I show this figure from work we're doing with Dan and Aradhna Tripati Bhattacharya using multiple approaches. They're using O17 and leaf wax hydrogen isotopes respectively. And we're going to be integrating these multiple hydroclimate proxies together in these different lake basins to understand how it is that we have more moisture in the Southwest during both colder and warmer intervals to better be able to draw from the paleoclimate record the underlying thermodynamic and dynamic drivers of moisture balance. We've also begun expanding this work to examine lakes in South America and in East and Western Africa with colleagues at universities in each of these areas. Now, for the next part of the talk, I want to highlight the work we're doing to support co-developed research and education projects with tribal authorities and community-based organizations. This in part is directly addressing priorities of our partners that want to build STEM capacity with respect to using Western STEM tools. And these are in communities, partners that are working in communities that have been the most impacted by injustice and are the most impacted by injustice. At the same time, they're also working with us to build our capacity in higher education STEM spaces for working ethically with communities, building our own cultural awareness, and being able to bring together more diverse and innovative knowledge systems than what we have in the kind of the hegemony of Western STEM by braiding together different culturally based knowledge systems. We also have really specific ideas about ways to collaborate to bring together different knowledge systems that I show here. And and I'd be excited to kind of talk more about that in one-on-one meetings or afterwards in the Q&A. I do want to highlight that this work is also led by a number of students, practitioners, postdocs, and others. So to give you just a few examples of what this project looks like, we have one major emphasis, which is a co-designed program on Indigenous waters. For us as geoscientists in higher education, it's meant we've been learning about tribal histories and protocols, doing our own learning and reading, engaging in listening sessions with our partners, holding workshops and discussions for ourselves, for our students, working with our ethnic studies centers on campus for some of this, on working with tribal communities, thinking about implications of things like data sovereignty, and protocol discussions. We've also created a board of practitioners with expertise to steer the work we do, so a tribal board for this project. We also are supporting research led by Indigenous and other BIPOC students, postdocs, and faculty that really is kind of originating in the higher education space. From the work I described from Alexandria Arnold, looking at hydroclimates using geochemistry, sedimentary geology for climate model evaluation, to research in Indigenous archaeology to look at different environmental management strategies through time, and then also ethnography to examine impacts of changes in water on communities in the recent past and at present. We also are collaborating together with our external partners on tribally led projects that include the surveying of springs, creating curriculum together, thinking about ways to develop policy recommendations around groundwater reliance and water access and resilience, and then even technical assessment of water quality and hydrology. In another project, we're collaborating to support research led by tribal stewards from the Amamutsan Tribal Band and some of their partners, as well as other practitioners that are community members around coastal marine stewardship and land stewardship. And this shows an image from some recent field work with them. So their expertise includes cultural resource management, ethnobotany. We're sharing expertise with geochemistry and environmental DNA as they share their expertise with us. We're working together on field and lab-based projects, and it's been exciting to see the ideas and projects that the tribal stewards are designing, including relating to looking at the impact of localized conservation and climate mitigation efforts, from kelp and seagrass restoration, wetlands restoration, to dam removal, on hydrology, carbonate chemistry, biodiversity, including of culturally significant species. These are just a few of the ways that we're collaborating. I show some the other areas where we're working together on equitable partnership and exchange. And then as a final example, we actually just had a workshop for this morning, fourth one in this series. I've been working to support a Navajo Science Scholars Network that's environmentally and geo-focused. This is really based on initial relationship building that occurred several years ago at two Diné institutions, two tribal institutions, and then continued reciprocal visits, listening sessions that have also then led to fieldwork, research experience, seminars, and so forth. With COVID-19 last year, we of course engaged with all of our partners to see how they were doing and how we could support them, and learned about the scale of impact on undergraduates and recent graduates and their families at tribal colleges on the Navajo Nation. So we worked on proposal writing to support their faculty and students and graduates and their families. This workshop series was also something that was requested, and so it has over 50 Indigenous participants, most of whom are Navajo, and is the project is designed and led by a Navajo dominated geoscience, by a group of Navajo dominated geoscientists. Finally, in the last part of the talk, I want to describe some of the works we're doing locally with the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science and more broadly in the national landscape. I hope that many of you have seen this study by Rachel Bernard and Emily Cooperdock that looked at NSF's data on PhDs in this country over 40 years after the Civil Rights Act. What they showed was that at the PhD level in Earth, atmospheric, and marine sciences, there was little change. You could count on one hand the number of Black PhDs in any of these fields in a given year, the number of Latinx, a number of indigenous across all Native nations, and even the number of Asian and Pacific Islander. I think the year I graduated with my PhD in 2002, I was like one of 3 or 6 in the whole country, AAPI women. And so this is really troubling because other fields are doing a lot better. In fact, we are one of the worst fields in terms of progress on diversity. And this is something that is really problematic given the fact that higher education institutions really help to shape national culture. If you look at most rooms of power brokers or leaders in all sorts of spaces, they come through higher education. If we think of ourselves as operating within our labs, departments, universities, as being part of an ecological framework that is shaped by society, but also can feed into society, we can see that there are a number of different ways that we can act to make a difference, but that it's also really critical to have kind of an interconnected set of interventions if we really want to achieve systemic change. So I show this ecological model on the lower left. Now, in fact, we do see at a number of levels, people have been pushing in society for quite a while, but that there have been waves where there's been really kind of coordinated pushes to reshape society, including the institutions within it. In fact, organizing for access to education and employment in higher education spaces has always been on the forefront of civil rights organizing. And so when we, excuse me, so when we look at some of the kind of recommendations that have come out from geoscience leaders and leaders in other STEM spaces, there are kind of a series of key practices that are recommended. There's a piece by Vernon Morris that talks about some of these issues that came out just this year in AGU Advances about what are critical factors for advancing racial equity today. He described it's critical to develop a robust system of educational pathways to focus on sustainable and equitable collaborations between historically white, predominantly white institutions and minority serving institutions, as well as to have fearless leadership. And so, in doing this, we can help really continue to bend towards justice and really have the kind of widespread reconstruction that we need to have. So the work that we've been doing with the center has, instead of having, a center for tropical research or a center for isotope geochemistry as the kind of heart of the center, and then the broader impacts, the folks who participate in the work we do to open up space as being some of the kind of more superficial level aspects of it. In fact, broadening participation is at the heart of it. And we argue that the intellectual merit, the science in all of these areas that we touch on is what benefits. And so this center has a series of goals that include systemic change. We've built a structure that is unique. It's a multi-tiered fellowship program ecosystem. We go from high school students all the way through faculty, so people see continuous pathways into leadership. We really build on relationships that I've developed over the last 30 years with minority serving institutions and historically white institutions. And we focus on equitable resource allocation, leadership skills training, because we recognize that faculty, including myself, many of us have not benefited from training in things that relate to, say, like critical race theory, gender theory, and other areas that are actually so important to have to be prepared to navigate the cultural challenges that we've inherited because of these systemic and deep-seated historical injustices. So some of the practices we engage in addition to faculty development and early career development and partnerships and networks, also includes things like the partnerships that I described with diverse communities, for example, having culturally responsive practices. And in fact, many of the elements that were identified in a study by Silvia Hurtado, a member of the National Academy of Education, as being fundamental for inclusive science. And this is work that she did that was a meta-analysis of successful biomedical programs that have made an impact on diversity. So the program that we built started small. It started off from a structure developed in my own lab. When I was hired as a faculty member, I wrote an NSF Career Award to structure my resources in a particular way. And then really worked to build that out over time. And then after a period of time, started to think about what were ways that we could really scale up to start to see measurable shifts in departmental and institutional cultures. Now, what I show here are the demographics of folks that we've supported. Our center is open to everyone. Anybody can become a member, anyone can become a fellow, but our early career fellows, we certainly do use an equity lens for distributing resources. I also show the benefits of our model in terms of the higher skills or the kind of pro-social skills that people develop, but also the technical skills, their confidence as a scientist, and their scientific understanding that grows from being in such an environment. Now, our center also responded to the events of last summer in several ways. Part of our work included thinking about ways we could amplify the voices of Black students and Black faculty and allies who are calling for reform of higher education spaces. And so we did an anti-racism demands letter analysis. We have about 60 letters from students and faculty and staff demanding change from their institutions. And we see that this is a roadmap for transformation, for action planning. Most of the responses most of the calls for action include things like institutional advocacy work, public stances around anti-racism, organizational commitments to change, but also personal commitments to change from individual faculty, diversification of faculty at all levels, both junior and senior levels. Now, while that was across higher education and predominantly from STEM, there are similar calls that are occurring in different ways within the geosciences, from op-eds to this call for action, No Time for Silence, that Vernon Morris wrote and that I and other BIPOC geoscience scholars co-wrote, as well as the change.org petition from Hendrada Ali that has now over 30,000 signatures. The No Time to Silence call to action I described has the membership, it has multiple professional societies that have endorsed it, and their membership represents over 60,000 geoscientists. So that's a lot of people calling for change. So at the university level, I really want to highlight what that looks like. It means hiring, promoting, supporting, and retaining BIPOC faculty. People are out there. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you're interested in getting names of folks so I know we're on the job market as opposed to being assistant professors. There's really finding ways. It's also important to find ways to include ethical anti-racist policies when thinking about admissions and promotions. Thinking about what does equitable access to mentoring look like? What do our classroom practices look like? What can we bring into historically white institutions from minority serving institutions? Now, also, I initiated and contributed to planning at the national level for workshops on cultivating champions and allies that are trying to navigate equity-related issues and change in the geoscience. And so we have a series of workshops we've done, from exploring barriers administratively to diversifying faculty to tenure and promotion to strategies for student organizing. And we have another workshop that's coming up just in May. Now, finally, if the department hasn't yet had filmmaker Kendall Moore, who's a journalism professor at the University of Rhode Island, come to give a talk and show one of her films, you definitely should do so. She has these really powerful films, 3 of them on obstacles faced by people in STEM, another one on what allyship looks like, and a 3rd one on decolonizing science. And these workshops end up leading to really intense discussions that end up facilitating change. I've seen that just over the last few years in the spaces I've seen her do these workshops in previously and in tracking the organizations. So with that, I'm at time, and it's good because I'm on my last slide, so I'll put up this summary and take questions and say thank you.
Thank you so much, Aradhna. That was an awesome talk and really informative. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. Yeah, I can see hands going up. So Uber, why don't you take it away? Will?
Yeah. Thanks. That was a great talk. I wonder if you could comment on the success you've had or the challenges you've had sort of getting Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science to be kind of accepted and published and to stand on equal footing with Western science. Because in the examples that I've often seen for like in paleoseismology literature, it's it's often taken only to the extent that it can be verified by Western science. Like if we can't see a paleoseismological record of it, then the kind of oral history of events is sort of disregarded. And I wondered if you could comment on, yeah, kind of your experience working in that space.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a handful of things there that I'll comment on. First of all, I think just more broadly about, publications being an outcome from this work. That's one thing I would call into question. I don't approach our partnerships with an emphasis on publication. And so I think, really kind of engaging in that healthy relationship building is not to have, I don't have a focus on that product in some sense, right? If that's something that tribal authority wants to do, the stewards want to do, our partners want to do, then they're welcome to lead that. I'm happy to support that. Or if they want to see those workloads distributed in a different way, I'm there to support. And at the same time, I also try to make sure that the students and postdocs that are involved in this work, that we also have conversations about what parts of the work are publishable by them. Is it something that actually doesn't involve our partner at all and is actually a separate thing altogether? So yeah, that's one thing. I think a second thing is that the approach that is usually taken in STEM, including in geoscience, is what you've articulated, which is that we need the Western STEM to validate the indigenous STEM. But in fact, that I think is a fallacy, right? In fact, having the things that I think about are that, I have these questions about rainfall, for example, in the Western US, but I've also visited culturally significant sites and seen from the record of, in drawings that exist or in oral histories that exist, that in fact, there's already knowledge about whether there was more rainfall. It's just that we don't have the geochemistry for it, but that knowledge right there is actually, was what we needed. What we can do with the geochemistry is quantify that, right? But that's different, right? So we're not actually trying to validate indigenous knowledges. And so I think as geoscientists, like thinking about what are we doing when we're even in a space where this is about validation, instead of accepting that there have been observations made of the environment for, in some cases, hundreds of years, in some cases, thousands of years, and that those observations, in fact, are something that we could use to validate some of our models, and approaching projects in that way could be, I think, extremely, extremely helpful. And we also, sometimes our partners have said, we want to do this to validate what we already know, but that way folks in the Western STEM space will believe us. And this was, like from work with community organizers who are looking at issues with lead, for example, and they already know that lead is in the community and making them toxic. It's, creating these toxic environments. It's that, city councils, states, the EPA, just trying to get folks to come in and actually do the cleanup and believe that this is having an impact. And so we try to be really, we just try to make sure we follow our partner's lead, and that we're also not with the approach we use, the language that we use, then espousing some type of hierarchy there unintentionally. One of the things that Alexandra Arnold and I and Allison Ramirez, another graduate student who's she's in sociology or gender studies, and is also part of this Indigenous Waters project that we've been talking about, is our geochemical data can only pick up certain, it has uncertainties associated with it. We can only validate models that were run for the last glacial maximum, the Pliocene, the early Eocene. But there's a lot of interest in thinking about models just for the last 1,000 years, and can we validate those? Well, there's no way our geochemistry is going to be able to do that, and at the same time, there are oral histories that could be used to actually validate the physics of models, right? And so to me, that's something that, it is going to take, it actually takes having practitioners that are willing to share their expertise, and And then, to be able to demonstrate actually these models don't have an accurate representation of these processes because they're not able to get the oral histories right. I think by publishing in that type of way, we actually can start to change the narrative. And so I think for the area of like seismology that you've described, maybe there are also ways to think about doing that when thinking about the paleoseismic record, and how you design studies so that it's what's actually being validated. So just lots of thoughts, and I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Will. So our next question is from Mike Evans.
Well, my first question is, would you like to take a minute and get a drink of water?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
You addressed one of my questions already with Will, so I'll ask the other one, which goes way back to your first part of your talk. I think you showed a slide that showed change in precipitation with change in temperature, and you had a curve for the paleo data, and you had a curve for what you labeled modern, and they were very different. And I wanted to know what you thought about that.
So I'm really curious. I'm not sure which.
It would have been toward the very end of your part one.
Yeah, so let's take a look.
Did you really get a drink of water? You drank from your prop, you did. Okay, this one right here, number 10, no, number 18, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, this one here?
Yes.
Yeah. And so let's see. So these are our clumped data here. The blue is all data, the black are the weighted means for gastropods and tufa. And then these are individual samples. And then this is the glaciological modeling that was done by Brendan Quark, and what, the results for the Bonneville and Provo and the modern that he had. So, yeah. So this is basically where the modern would sit, the 0, 1, and then this would be the last glacial maximum data.
So I guess I was interested in the difference between the red curve and the purple and green and black curves.
Yeah, okay. I see. So, excuse me. So I think that with this, the purple and green curves represent the Provo and Bonneville shorelines, and what combination of temperature changes, which would influence evaporation rates, and precipitation changes they could coincide with. So this shows that there's a number of different combinations of precipitation and evaporation that would give us the Provo shoreline, or that would give us the Bonneville shoreline. And then our approach then lets us constrain that temperature, and we estimate a change in precipitation. What's also shown here are some of the constraints from Brennan's glaciological modeling for the LGM and the late glacial, and what kind of combination of temperature and precipitation changes that could be reconciled with.
And the red curve is from something like Helvin Soden?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, got it. So but the red curve is like your point, I suppose, is that the red curve is subparallel with the green and purple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and for stepping through it. I'm sorry I rushed through stuff so quickly. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, Mike, for the question. I think now we should take this opportunity to thank Aradhna again. So please raise your virtual hands, and thanks, Aradhna, for a really awesome talk. And we can now move into discussion. So Aradhna,